Preaching is an art form, and like any art form, few of us are born masters of the craft. When you reflect on the ministers who have impacted you the most with their preaching, the final sermon you hear from the pulpit was not the first draft of their message. That sermon that you enjoyed, the one that touched both your heart and your mind, the one that you still remember quotes and phrases from, well, that was the result of hours, if not years of study, preparation, revisions, corrections, and humble prayer. The word homiletics means the art of preaching, and like any art, perfect practice makes perfect presentation. So how do we move from the finger paints to the hammer and chisel and the marble block? Let's look at the text, the Homiletical Handbook. This book is divided into 3 parts with 22 chapters. Part 1, Understanding our Homiletical Task. Chapter 1, The Importance of Preaching. If you've been in church long enough, you've probably heard somebody call the pastor the preacher. What is preaching? Why do we preach? Is preaching objective or subjective? And what has been the historical role of preaching in the church? By answering these fundamental questions, preaching finds its purpose, value, and goal, not only as a vocational skill of the pastor, but also as a needed communal teaching and guiding of the church into the deeper truths of God and of the Christian life. Chapter 2, A Rationale for Sermon Structure. Remember that pastor that we talked about beforehand, the one whose sermon you remember even till today? Chances are the reason it was so memorable and easy to follow was due to the sermon structure. Meaning, and that's how the pastor intended the sermon to be heard. The relationship between the speaker and the hearer is a unique one, and if the pastor has not done his job well, the congregation will not hear what he is saying. This is why structure is so important for the preacher. Clearly, identifying the main lessons or theme of the sermon is vital for the congregation and the preacher. And there are a variety of methods of preaching, and it is important to distinguish their differences and to recognize their distinctions. Such methods includes topical preaching. This is where a particular topic, generally a current relevant cultural subject, is explored through the lens of Scripture. In other words, these sermons' subjects are based on a given Scripture's texts, while the main points and the subpoints are not based on that text. Textual preaching. These are sermons that are based on 1 or 2 verses of Scripture, with the main points of the message coming from the text itself, often from phrases or clauses that are somewhat equal weight in importance. The main points are built around the central theme found in the text. Some points are inferred from the text, but are usually taken from parallel passages or outside of Scripture. Expository preaching. This is where a particular passage of Scripture is studied, often word for word or verse by verse, in hopes of better understanding what is trying to be taught to the reader. Part 2, Developing our Homiletical Technique. Chapter 3, Preliminary Process to Homiletics. This is where the pastor's homework begins. Number 1, a selection of the text. Number 2, identifying the history, literary genre, and theological context of the text. And 3, the textual study itself, of focusing on the actual words. Chapter 4, the keyword method. This method is employed when there are 2 or more parallel ideas in the text. The purpose of this method is to present a unified front, clear in purpose, full in its argument, scriptural in its authority, and applicable to its hearers. This method follows 12 steps, which can be found on pages 40 through 57. Chapter 5, the analytical method. This method is designed to teach as opposed to persuade. The ultimate goal of this method is to inform the congregation, not to convince them. This method follows 9 steps, which can be found on pages 60 through 67. Chapter 6, textual method. This method is seen as expository, since the purpose of the expository sermon is to expose the meaning of the text. This method follows 9 steps, which are found on pages 69 through 74. Chapter 7, problem-solving patterns. The emphasis of this method is that it focuses on the authority of Scripture. The setup begins with a question and explores the answer. This can also be called situational preaching or pastoral preaching. This method follows 9 steps, which can be found on pages 77 through 82. Chapter 8, the comparative method. In this method, the message is delivered through metaphor or simile, like parables, imagery, or things that represent other things. A biblical example of this is found in Psalm chapter 1, verse 3, where a tree planted by the water is a metaphor for a righteous person. This method follows 9 steps, which can be found on pages 84 through 89. Chapter 9. The Syllogistic Method. This preaching method is pure educational, since it employs deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is where you take general truths to arrive at a specific truth. Logic, or the art and science of reasoning well, is of the most importance when developing a sermon with this method. This type of sermon follows a categorical syllogism, whereby you begin with a major premise, which leads you into the minor premise, and from these two statements you arrive logically at the conclusion. This method has 9 steps, which can be found on pages 91 to 95. Chapter 10. Inductive Patterns. This method is the inverse of the syllogistic method. As the previous method took general truths to arrive at a specific truth, the inductive patterns method begins at a specific truth and arrives at a general truth. In other words, the sermon that begins with its conclusion and works backwards to end with its premise. This method follows 9 steps, which can be found on pages 98 to 102. Chapter 11. The Narrative Approach. Of the homiletic method studied so far, this one distinguishes itself from the rest because it is not based on an argument or a defense or a particular belief, practice, or theme. Rather, this message approaches sermons and the sermon preparation through the art of storytelling. This method assumes certain things to be true without proving whether or not they are. Now, this does not lessen the value or effectiveness of this method. This method follows 6 steps, which can be found on pages 108 through 113. Part 3. Using our homiletical treasury. The final 11 chapters focus on 2 things. First is how to preach from the different literary genres found in Scripture. The first point is important since we do not read all the Bible in the same manner. Poetry is read different than law. History reads differently from the epistles. Wisdom literature reads differently from apocalyptic texts. Some parts are meant to be taken literally, and others are meant to be taken figuratively. We see story versus history, and descriptive sections from prescriptive passages. Second, we need to be able to recognize the historical and theological context of these literary genres. It may very well be that the various literary genre types have a specific goal and purpose in God's communication with His people. After reading and studying this book, you should be able to do the following. Recognize and analyze the biblical text in its historical, theological, and genre context. Formulate and structure sermons and homilies following the provided methods. Identify the strengths and weaknesses of each homiletical method. Experiment with and measure the effectiveness of the varying homiletical methods. This book was selected by the IPHC and NHM Schools of Ministry for the following reasons. Just because you are a good pastor doesn't necessarily make you a good preacher. This is a phenomenal book, one of my favorites in the credentialing process, because of its practical, logical, and clear explanation for the importance of healthy homiletical practices. Like all professions, you will get better over time. In addition to the Homiletical Handbook workbook, you have an additional assignment. Write at least a 1-page essay in Times New Roman at 12-point font on one of the 2 following topics. Of the various homiletical methods presented to you in this book, which method do you think is the most effective and why? Or, of the various homiletical methods presented to you in this book, which presents the most difficulty for you? This has been course MCP 2.05 in the Ordination Level 1 Credentialing Series. Upon watching this course, please read the assigned text, complete the workbook, and type your essay. Please print the essay and place it in the back of your workbook. The next course will be over the text, A Practical Guide to Pastoral Ministry. Blessings, and study to show yourself approved.